Well, Adam, another episode. How's it going?
Yeah,
Welcome.
doing well. It's been a great week. You might recognize that I'm missing a beard.
Yeah, what happened there? Look
Yeah, little shaving incident that turned into now clean shaven. So I guess either you're gonna have to find a new podcast host, or we're gonna have to change the sign, or maybe no one cares. So
I don't think anybody's really gonna care, man.
okay, good. Then I can stay.
I think you can stay.
All right, great. Well, welcome to the podcast, folks. Thanks for being here. And before we jump in, we've got a great guest today. David, I'll let you intro him in just a moment. But before we jump in there, we want to invite you, if we've got a resource we've put together for organizations to really look at their RevOps readiness, an assessment they can download and work through and just kind of see where they fit within that scale. So if you want to get a copy of it, it's absolutely free. You can go to our website at revsearch.io/readiness. So go ahead, intro
Awesome.
our guest here.
Yeah, Adam, excited to have Toni Holhbein on the podcast. Toni, welcome.
Toni, good to have
Thanks.
you.
From the far place of what is it, Copenhagen, correct?
That's right, Copenhagen,
Yeah.
Denmark.
That's awesome. So first, a broad guest we have on the podcast. Just really quickly about Toni, he's got a rich background. He's doing a lot of great work in the RevOps space, helping companies get one view around their data. And so he's got a background in consulting. He was a RevOps leader. He's got an operator experience. He was a CRO. He's had multiple exits, has helped companies grow. And he's co-founded Growblocks and is also the co-host of the Revenue Formula. So welcome, Toni. Fill us in a little bit more on your background. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, boys.
Yeah.
So I am, so actually my background is actually German. So, coming from that neck of the woods here in Europe, kind of moved to Copenhagen, Denmark 12 years ago or so. And basically since then, spent all my time in B2B SaaS. That's basically what it was. I had like two longer, nice journeys, where basically in the first one went from something in the back office. So I was one of the first 10 joining something in the back office to then realizing, hey, maybe this RevOps thing could be fun. And back then we didn't call it like that. I think in 2013 or something like that. Looking back now, it's like, oh, that was probably revenue operations. Then spent 3 years in the US, New York City, was fantastic. And then eventually became CRO. Then we sold the company, jumped the next one, sold that one as well. And then basically decided, hey, how difficult can it be? And then jumping in and founding Growblocks.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, three things I'm grateful for. Number one, that we're not doing this podcast in German because I'd be lost. The two of you would have a great conversation and I'd say hello and goodbye. Number two, you have a great looking studio. So
Yes.
Love it when we have somebody that really has a good looking studio to join us. And the third thing, I don't recall now. I had a third thing, but I don't remember what it is. But we're glad to have you and looking forward to the conversation.
Let's dive right in.
Yeah.
So the first thing we want to do, Toni, is kind of capture your progression from RevOps to CRO. I think that's going to be really interesting for people to hear because you are actually one of the few that made it from RevOps to CRO, right? So let's start there. Walk us through a little bit of that journey.
Yeah, happy to. So it's not a straightforward one. This is not a super well-traveled path. It's not the typical, the VP of sales walks to the CEO and is like, hey, I want to have a C-level title, and then walks out of CRO.
Yeah.
I think in my case, I mean, it's also luck, honestly. It has a lot of, to do with that. In my case, started, revenue operations, and that really meant, sales operations first, and then a couple of other operations folks. So the VP marketing was like, hey, I want to have a Toni on my team. And I was like, okay, cool, let's do that. But let's put that person into my team instead. And then suddenly we had revenue operations. And it added on top. So I was also running the lead gen team. So what now, Clay and all kinds of other tools are doing automatically. People were doing this in the past. So I was running that. And then there was this team that we founded, which was doing those outbound calls. Young team. And it wasn't working according to everyone. And I was like, well, let me try. So I took on the SDR team, basically. Magically, it worked wonderful suddenly, obviously. I mean, as those things sometimes do. And this is, in those two situations, this is, I think, where I was able to achieve something that is sometimes difficult and kind of made an obstacle for RevOps, is leading larger teams, right? Because if you're a RevOps leader, it's not a volume team. You're trying to keep it small. You're not arguing all the time for, I need 5 more folks. It's like if you have a team of 3 or 4 or 5 people, you're already kind of a, big head of revenue operations, right? And if you then want to step up to CRO, they're saying, well, you don't know how to lead any people. You only led 5 people. You can't, how are you going to lead an organization of 100 folks?
Yeah.
Right. So it's fair objection, and kind of that kind of fell away for me. Then I spent 2-3 years in the States building up the office there, and there working fully across the whole commercial organization, and starting to kind of understand how this whole sales thing works a little bit. And then over time, because I was setting the targets for the sales team, and I was running the SDR team. Later on, I was running the product, the performance marketing team. So basically, I was supplying all the opportunities to the sales team, and I was setting targets to the sales team. So it was really nicely, built around that already, and I had a really good relationship with the VP of sales anyway. And then at some point, the CEO came to me and was like, hey, you need to come back to Europe. And then I want you to run the whole thing. And really the only change was then to also add the CSM team on top, right? And that is, that is not the crazy, RevOps in the corner and then boom, suddenly CRO. There were a couple of progression points between, which I think made that decision a bit easier for my CEO.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think maybe sometimes the biases would be, well, the chief revenue officer is really just another title for a chief sales officer or chief commercial officer, right? And so the thought is this progression really needs to come out of somebody who's carried a bag, who's been a seller, who knows the ins and outs of what sales is all about. But as we were having this conversation earlier, you brought up an interesting point about 2 things, kind of when it makes sense for an organization to really have a true CRO, right? So there's a size, a scale, a certain function as a go-to-market team. So when does that make sense? And then how someone with your background, anybody that has a background that really came out of more operations, and the whole idea of revenue operations, we're touching all of those. If we're doing it right, we're touching all of those different functions anyway. So we should have some understanding of each of those. But how a model would work where if that CRO does have a background out of operations, how they're able to be effective with the correct lieutenant structure. And so I'd love to have your thoughts and just unpack that a little bit, when it makes sense and what that structure looks like.
So when should you hire a CRO, right? Kind of that's the initial question. And in order to answer that, you need to ask yourself, what problem is that person actually solving for you? What problem is the role there to kind of fix? Because you will need someone running marketing. You will need someone running sales. You need someone running CS, right? And they will probably be kind of successful, because otherwise you would replace them instead of putting up a CRO on top, right? So what's the real issue that person is actually solving? And in many cases, when you think about the true CRO profile, and I'm not talking about the, hey, I'm a fractional CRO and I am helping, the founder at, product market fit to help figure out a couple of things. That's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about the person kind of running the go-to-market. And I would argue that you probably need to be at a scale of 10 to 15 million before this makes sense. And what then actually happens, and which then also becomes the purpose of the CRO, is the alignment between the go-to-market pieces, right? Really thinking as an architect, and I don't want to kind of borrow from Jacco's, vocabulary here, but thinking as an architect across the whole go-to-market, figuring out how all of the moving pieces translate into one another, and you generate the most amount of value for the least amount of cost, right? And that's the problem that needs to be solved. And before that is a big enough problem to spend, we talked about this, an OT of $500,000 and upwards of that, plus a chunk of equity on. You need to have a large problem around that maybe it needs to be solved between those silos, right? And then the other argument is, well, you really need probably someone that lifts the go-to-market responsibility that sits usually with the CEO, right? Usually sits with the CEO, lifts off his shoulders to then kind of accelerate and only focus on that. I think those are the 2 reasons actually, right? And when you then think about what are the right profiles for that, right? I would argue that even a sales leader is, why is that the right profile for that actually, right?
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, and I have like tons of respect for VP sales and so forth, right? So that's not what this is about, but really the skill set you need to have here is you need to understand each of the different components that make up the go-to-market, and you need to have a really good understanding for how are you going to build this up and drive this. And this is not about closing more deals. This is one part of the equation, right? It's generating more pipeline through all the, by now we're talking 20,000 different ways you can do that, right? So, Sangram from Go-to-Market Partners tries to there are like 6 go-to-market motions, and I would argue maybe it's really only 4 or whatever. But then if you unfold each of them, there's so many tactics and so many plays and stuff, right? That's this side. And then you still have the CS side, and how do you drive expansion and how do you do all of these things? Which again, sales is really, really important part of those 3, but it's also really just one part, right? And really the appreciation for the other pieces is extremely important, right? So one question that I sometimes have, so I kind of get why RevOps is not so often jumping into the CRO role, but one of my questions is, why is it not so many CMOs doing that? Why is it not so many VPCS that actually kind of do that jump, right? Because they're kind of equally qualified, if you will, compared to VP sales,
Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point. You mentioned earlier the $500,000 OTE package. There's nothing worse than hiring that role into an immature business, right? And expecting value to be created in a massive way. It's the crawl, walk, run approach, right? Like you said, before that inflection point, there's really, you can split up that OTE package across really, really talented folks that can focus on their domains and build it up until you hit that point where you can say, hey, okay, we need a long-term vision. We need someone to orchestrate all of this, right? With the different pieces in place to now synthesize and move forward towards long-term value. So it's a totally different play.
Absolutely. And I think it also translates well to almost all the other roles as well, though, right? So I made the mistake once to hire VP sales too early. And then it's like, the guy starts, and you realize the sophistication level that he or she has been running on is like up here. And then it's like, okay, we actually need to do those 20 things first that a completely different person could have been doing actually, before actually, the organization is mature enough to actually leverage that skill of that person that you brought on board. And I think you can see it 2 ways. You can say like, let's wait with that hire, or let's bring that hire in early. Let's avoid all of those mistakes and get faster to that place. But again, it's always a little bit of a balancing act, right? How much money do you have in the bank? What can you afford? How do you want to go about it? And also, will you be able to hire the right talent for that job, right? Because if it's not a first time anything, they will ask those questions, right? They will do their due diligence on, is all of that stuff in place?
Sure.
Or do you really actually need me to be a janitor for the first 12 months to then actually get to the role that I'm being hired for?
I love the idea that you kind of debunk that idea that, well, sales leader into CRO, but why not equally marketing leader or customer success leader? And in that way, that's what partly makes sense for someone who, and I'm not talking about the title RevOps where it's really just sales ops, but I'm talking about a true RevOps function, true RevOps leader that's touching the entire funnel from lead gen all the way down to retention, churn, everything across the entire funnel. Somebody from that has the ability to understand each of those motions, each of those functions, and how they interplay with each other. And so then the interesting idea is that as that person steps into a role of a CRO, they're going to have the right leaders, the right lieutenants, the right individuals underneath them that are still very specialized in each of those segmented, or I don't want to say siloed because hopefully they're still aligned, but they are very skilled at their individual step of that overall go-to-market function.
So let's say it the other way around. I would have completely failed in both of those CRO roles if I hadn't had a super strong VP of sales, VP marketing, VP CS kind of running those departments. in some cases, it was part of the hiring process. So like, yeah, you probably will need to replace 2 out of those 3 over time. But that's what you need to have in place, in order to be successful as a, I would say, RevOps CRO. But equally so, I mean, then the alternative is like, well, we're hiring a CRO that has responsibility across, but really has VP responsibility over the sales function, right? And then also, I mean, your focus is going to be super diluted, right? You're going to be thinking about hitting this. I mean, I was thinking about hitting this quarter all the time also. But my 2 VP of sales for the different regions and we had a great arrangement. We always said, like, you guys focus on this quarter, I focus on next quarter. And we had that running for 12 quarters in a row. And then the 13th quarter was crunch time. I also had to focus on the same quarter as them. And boom, we missed that one, right? So it's like that was basically our arrangement, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't have worked. So one of the guys also went on paternity at some other later point. We're Denmark here. He left for 2 months.
Right.
He's gone.
I got 2 days off when our kid was born.
Yeah. So I mean, that's terrible. But like, he left for 2 months, and said it obviously with like long notice, and we worked around it and everything. And I tell you, I didn't enjoy those 2 months covering for him. Like,
sure.
I can tell you that, right? And this just goes to say that I'm not saying that VP sales is, that I don't have respect for that, or that they shouldn't be CRO. The real question I'm asking is, why isn't it revenue operations, right? Why isn't kind of these other roles?
So on that point of RevOps being a potential pathway into, having a potential pathway into that CRO role, you mentioned several things along your journey that kind of helped you, gain skill sets. What skills do you feel like RevOps leaders should focus on? And what knowledge, what experience, what were some of those inflection points for you along the journey that you can call out?
Yes. Very simple, actually. RevOps is not about tools, data, and processes like everyone always says. That's a thing. And RevOps for me, and especially if you want to be more senior, if you want to take the step up, RevOps is for me to understand the engine, understand the full funnel, understand the whole thing. And in the beginning, I was surprised when I, joined those executive team meetings as a VP of RevOps or director of RevOps, and later on in kind of different roles. I was surprised how in the CEO, CPO, CMO, and so forth kind of team, how very little understanding everyone had of how this thing actually works, how the commercial engine actually works, right? People were throwing around things like, let's just kill this and let's do more of that. And, why aren't they doing this? And we just need to work harder to hit this target. And that's where then a RevOps leader can actually shine and be like, well, no, we can't do that. If we do this, something else is going to break. If we do this, we can't just improve this, because even if we did, sales cycles and so forth, we're only going to see the result in 6 months from now, right? Kind of that way of thinking and then talking about it and articulating this. I think this is the actual superpower of revenue operations. And I kind of have it, it's not hate, but I really don't like when sales ops, RevOps goes in and tries to tell the VP of sales what to do or the VP marketing what to do. I think that's dangerous. Might be a career limiting move eventually.
Right.
But at the same time, you should be focusing on the stuff that they are not the expert in, which might be the other department, which might be downstream, upstream, kind of whatever that team is doing. So when you're talking to the VP marketing, the CMO, and the typical example is like those webinar MQLs, right? Kind of. And the VP of sales is just complaining about shit quality, right? So, and you as RevOps actually have the ability to sit in between and be like, well, it's shit quality because it's those webinars, and we should probably route them differently. And hey, CMO, that stuff is pretty valuable for sure, but the way we're processing on the sales side doesn't work. So let me help you, educate you on that blind spot that you have there, right? And there's so many other situations where RevOps should be stepping in and covering the other side of the silo, basically, and where this is not happening. Instead, what I see often is, hey, I read the stats, you should fire Kevin. Or you should, Mike is not performing, so you better put him on a PIP, right? Without knowing, well, yeah, Mike is going through a divorce, or Mike is, something else is happening, or his dog just died, or whatever it might, whatever might happen around it. That story you just don't have. And I think when you then throw those kind of like half-assed advice, I think very quickly you're being parked in the I'm not going to listen to that person anymore. And then you wonder why you don't have impact. You wonder why you don't have a seat at the table and so forth, right? So that's where I kind of would advise people to go towards, understand the engine, understand the funnel, and give that understanding to other people, but try and be very careful around, stepping on people's toes in each of the different areas that they have 10, 15, 20 years of experience in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, when you're sharing that kind of idea around there, one of the things that I think of is a great RevOps leader maybe not exposes is the right word, protects the blind spot of the folks that individual is working with. The challenge is that sometimes a RevOps person may see that as a lesser function, and maybe they're not quite mature in that, and they think, well, I don't want to be the one that just is supporting, and they just see it as a supportive role, as a lesser role. When the reality is that you're actually helping that leader be more effective, and you are fulfilling the role that you're there to perform by being the one that's protecting their blind spot, providing the information that helps them to be more effective, rather than being the one that says, well, I've got to have all the answers, and my job is to say this is what you should do, rather than give them the information to help them make the right decision.
I think so I never had that thought, myself in that regard. But I can understand that some people have. I think it's also a matter of perspective, right? I think you can also simply. This is. I literally heard this yesterday. I talked to a RevOps person, 600 people company, and she was like, "Hey Toni, have you heard of the term COO for go-to-market? So COO for GTM as a title?" And I was like, "No, I haven't heard of the term. I think it's silly for many reasons, but you can think of yourself as a RevOps person to be the COO to the CRO, right? Kind of the in the American language, the quarterback that makes sure, stuff is running and working out and nothing is falling between the cracks and so forth, right? Many people will find absolute fulfillment with that role and with that mission, by the way. And I think that's, yes, you need to be okay with that. You need to be okay with not wanting to be the head honcho. By the way, if you really want to, then you should also be, you probably might be a good candidate for becoming the CRO eventually, right? I think there's also lots of really strategically thinking senior VP RevOps that they never want to be the CRO. They never want to be standing in front of 250 people, running a town hall and being that person. They just don't want to do that, right? They rather want to be in the background and running things. Again, the mindset. Try and think of your mindset as the COO go-to-market, and maybe that lifts you up sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think this is a great segue into kind of the next point that we want to talk about. The whole idea you were talking about, blind spots. A lot of that comes from data, from being able to understand and communicate. So, let's transition just into the idea of full funnel visibility. And I know that that's something that you guys are super passionate about, you personally, and then that's what Growblocks is a lot of what it's about. But let's dive into that a little bit more. First of all, why does that even matter? What difference does it make in an organization if we have true full funnel visibility? And then we can talk about how we get there.
Yeah. Let's kind of go into the status quo right now, which is basically kind of the case with almost all companies out there. So, you have different tools installed for all of the different areas, and all of these tools are, by the way, fantastic. So this is not a pitch to kind of don't use just one tool or something like this. But what happens though is if you find issues that relate to one team, you can't go just one step up and open another tool and figure out what went wrong there that then is causing that, for example, right? And really, what I have seen myself, running as RevOps and CRO, I wanted to have this, on one screen, like everything from traffic to churn. I wanted to have the whole thing, the end-to-end piece, right? And I knew, yes, some data comes from Salesforce, some data comes from Google Analytics, some data comes from Gainsight, some data comes from like a finance, closed won ARR sheet or something like that. But ultimately, you want to have that all in one spot, because then you really can run the engine. Then you really can administer this, right? And what happens instead is people are jumping between different analytics function and different tools. Then they give up on that. So I've been living in that for a long time. Then they give up on that, and then they try and do BI, putting a lot of different pieces together, requesting more and more dashboards, all of that stuff. And then the last step, which is actually the last step, it's not BI. The last step really is people then give up and like, you know what? Let's do just spreadsheets.
Yeah.
let's just do that. Actually, let's download a couple of things. Let's have it in the spreadsheet. Because there you can add a couple of more intelligence layers of like A causes B and so forth, which is really, this is really the logic that exists in a funnel, and you want to have that in the tool, right? But then you sit in the spreadsheet, and you're the only one that can sit in there. If you want to show it to the CEO, they're like, this over my head, too much detail. And by the way, there's a mistake over there, and so forth, right? So that's really the problem that I see. Kind of, if you cannot see the full funnel, it becomes just so much more impossible to try and manage for the full funnel, right? And then the next step up is actually, and you two know this, right? So let's just say you're kind of missing revenue targets somewhere. And then you double click on that. And what everyone says in a board meeting is like, it's the sales team's fault. Like, hey, the ACV is too low, or they were lazy, or whatever it might be. And if you really look at the full engine, you might see like, no, actually, wait a minute. We missed by $500,000. But roughly 56% of that was actually caused by too few MQLs even coming, into the funnel. And yes, sales also underperformed because they gave too much discount and the sales cycles pushed out. We should ding them for that. We should go there and kind of fix that. But part of the problem also sits somewhere else, right? And if you don't have this visibility, it's really difficult to, you can't just sit in front of a 250 people go-to-market organization and yell at everyone and say like, be better.
Be better.
Right? That doesn't work. You need to kind of go way more nuanced. You're like, hey, the issue is over here. That's cost us a lot of money. Let's do an initiative exactly for that area next time in order to fix that going forward, right? And I think this is where there are all kinds of other, and that's why I'm obviously passionate about, there are all kinds of other bells and whistles I could be talking about, but the fundamental baseline problem is you want to see the whole thing, and that's then the starting point for you as RevOps to take action, but it's also a starting point for educating the rest of the team. Hey, this is how this whole thing actually hangs together, right? And this in a software versus, I don't know, spreadsheet or whatever you might do.
One thing I was just thinking about is, we're coming at it from the talent side, but you're describing what most companies are going through in this growth stage, right? That where you're getting ready to really scale. You want that growth, but because of the disjointed systems, because there's gaps all across your tools, you probably have too many. They're not talking to each other, right? You can't really diagnose what are those real gaps, what are those real pain points that we have that are holding us back from our true potential. And you're calling that out, the visibility. And a lot of the leaders we place because companies are going, we have no visibility. We don't, I don't know what's working, what's not working, right? The CRO was hired, right, to synthesize the organization. And he goes, I don't really know where to look first because the data's everywhere. It's messy. We've got an 8-year-old Salesforce instance that everybody and their mother have been editing and adding things to, and so this is what you're calling out. I mean, this getting to a place of seeing it all, and then you can start to drill in. Then you can start to dive into, hey, this is actually our real opportunity here, to go after the highest ROI, right?
Yes. But also make the right augmentation decision, right? So
Yes.
So many times, I think so many times the wrong VP got fired for something, It's like, when you think about it, how often was one of the VPs blamed that maybe simply actually wasn't true, right? And then the thing is, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot twice, right? You kind of take the wrong head out and then need to replace that person. And you're still sitting with, maybe the one, or it doesn't need to be a person, but the thing that was broken, you're still dragging that around, right? So kind of these kind of decisions are pretty crucial. And I would even say in the current environment, they're probably even more crucial than they have been, 5 years ago, right? You don't want to make those mistakes because that will, obviously kind of that will filter through into your CAC payback, CAC to LTV, into your fundability and all of that jazz. So I think the stakes are pretty high kind of these days to upgrade how you operate the engine or how I operate the factory, Jocko would say.
Yeah. And I love the idea that it gives you visibility in almost real time. And if you're diagnosing it properly, you can see issues that are coming up long before the quote unquote final product. I think about like,
That's right.
if I'm making a cake, right? I dump a bunch of ingredients in, put it in the oven, it sits in there. So we spend an hour and a half doing this, and then isn't until the first bite till I know whether I did it right or not, right? And that's kind of the old school model of like, well, did we hit our target this quarter? Did we hit our goal this year? Versus the idea that as I'm making a cake, there's some kind of alarm bell that goes off that says, hey, you didn't put enough flour or enough sugar into this, so that I don't have to wait until the end of the quarter or end of the year to find out, or end up baking the cake that I totally messed it up. But instead it's giving me notification as I go along.
No, but it's actually so funny, right? And I know we're kind of probably coming up on time soon, but it's so funny when you think about then there's a QBR, and then you ask, so why did we miss, right?
Yeah.
And there's we didn't generate enough pipeline. Okay, so when did that actually happen? Well, that happened in the last month before the quarter even started. Okay, why did that happen? We didn't hire, and this campaign didn't work out. So and then you kind of look at the executive and you say like, so we knew we were gonna miss 6 months ago,
or we should have known.
Why?
Right.
Why didn't we do anything about that? Right. So and this is the whole thing about the I love the bacon and cake analogy there. But that's actually what it is, right? Kind of you knew already. Well, you could have known. To your point, you could have known 6 months ago. You had the data already 6 months ago that you're probably gonna run into a tough quarter now. And now you're acting all surprised doing the QBR and then blaming 6 months ago again. It's like there's something wrong in how we deal with those issues.
Yeah, for sure. Toni, it's been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks.
Just really enjoyed it. David, anything that closing words, anything you got to add before we wrap up?
I mean, if listen to the listeners, reach out to Toni. Strike up a conversation. If you have questions for him, reach out to him. He's all over LinkedIn.
Yeah, and I can tell you, he's got a podcast that they do. It's great. They've got a newsletter that you can sign up for. I get it every week. I read it. It's great. So if you want to grow and learn, check out what Toni's doing. Check out what Growblocks is doing. Follow them, and they've got a lot of value that they're putting out there. So, Toni, enjoyed it. Thanks so much for being with us, man.
Thanks a bunch, David and Adam. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.